desolate of all human life. And yet, it looked as though there should be somebody there. Everything was neatly stowed away. A meal had been prepared and eaten and washed up. In the captain's cabin, the log had been made up to 9 days previous, nothing untoward. There were some signs of minor damage. Make of it what you will, that's storm damage. They found that the hatch of the cargo hold had been blown off, and there was quite a bit of water there, about 3 meters of water or more. The hold contained a cargo of, well, it was brandy. It was a concentrated spirit for fortifying wines, and it was going from America to Genoa to be put into things like vermouth and so on. Anyway, what else did they find? Yes, bedrooms left as if people had just left them, hoping to come back. Valuables left around, money. Everything as if there should have been a living ship, but no people. So they took it in tow, and they actually brought it to Gibraltar, where the British government agent, Sir Solly Flood in those days, instigated an inquiry. And speculation ran riot, because don't forget, this was the time when the media as we know today was in its infancy, but intending to make a good job of either informing or entertaining people. And there was an inquiry, but unfortunately, for a couple of good reasons, I don't suppose we'll ever really know the truth about that. Reason number one was because this gentleman, the British government representative, he'd made up his mind what had happened anyway, and he wasn't going to be swayed or persuaded with any evidence to the contrary. As far as he was concerned, it was pirates, and that was that. But there was an enormous amount of evidence to the contrary. The second complicating factor was that at that time, a budding author, one or two you will have heard of, called Arthur Conan Doyle, took this story, or at least took the bare bones of this report, and wove a fictional account all around it, and it was published in a lot of magazines in London as fact. And of course that's where the misspelling came in, because he changed the name from Mary to Mary, among lots of other things that he changed. But you see, the problem is then that so many modern authors will, instead of researching the original facts, will just take these accounts, fiction and all, and treat them as fact. So this is why to be a good researcher, one has to go back wherever possible to all the original documents. And I'll try and unravel some of the threads of the Mary Celeste case a little bit later, complex though it is. Now, moving on a little bit, many disappearances of seagoing vessels in the 1800s, the 1900s, and even up to the present day. One of the best authenticated cases that I've come across was actually in 1962. There were two ships. One was towing another one, and the chap in charge of the ship being towed, he was having a bit of a sleep on his bunk. All of a sudden, he woke to find himself being dragged underwater. And he did get out, he spluttered, and someone clung to a bit of timber while his ship got sucked down to a great big hole. The towing ship had been trying very desperately to cut the line because they were in danger of being sucked down the same hole. Anyway, they did pick him up eventually, half dead and half drowned. But that is probably the strongest piece of evidence we have of something very strange going, and actually taking a ship down to the depths. The Wild Goose, it was called. Now, we've been talking about on-surface craft. Many of the stories that you'll have read about, and I'll have read about, concern aircraft. I think one of the famous ones, although it actually got nothing to do with the triangle itself, was the infamous Flight 401, where that actually crashed into a swamps on the mainland, just on the mainland. But its claim to infamy was the fact that when they killed everyone on board, and they actually managed to salvage some of the components and build them into other aeroplanes, and the ghosts came with them. And John Fuller's written a couple of very interesting accounts of the instances there whereby people who were associated with that past plane sort of came onto the new one. Anyway, so a little bit of a kipper really, but I'm mentioning it because people do associate it with the triangle, whereas there's a perfectly normal, if unpleasant explanation. However, what do we make about the Martin Mariner and the TBM Avengers case? Because this has come into prominence recently in the news. What happened was that on the 5th of December, 1945. A familiar date, you've heard of that before. That was the same day, the same month when the Mary Celeste was found, wasn't it? Coincidence? Never mind. Just a thought to bear in mind. Anyway, 5th of December 1945. So it seemed a fairly routine training flight from Fort Lauderdale in Texas. 5 training planes took off one after the other and went out over this infamous area in strict formation. An hour later, there were frantic radio calls to base saying, we don't know where we are. It's all so very strange. I can't see land. I can't see anything. It's all white. Lots of things like that. And then, don't come after us because cut. Well, of course, they did go after them. A number of flights immediately took off from that base and other bases to see what had happened. It lost all communication. That was within half an hour. An hour later, one plane flew into a cloud and was never seen again. So within the space of a couple of hours, they had lost 5 planes, all in one formation, and one of the ones that was sent out to rescue it disappeared entirely without trace. Now, as I say, there's been some speculative reporting in the press in the last few weeks that they may well have found the wreckage. But be that as it may, it still as yet doesn't give us any clues as to why these things have happened. Why have they happened? Well, let's not stop there. Oh, incidentally, no. Yes, perhaps we should stop there just for half a second, because one of the very bizarre additional incidents was that at 7 o'clock, some 3 hours later, that same day, the control tower picked up a message saying FT, FT, FT. Just that. This was the call sign of the last plane that disappeared. It was received 3 hours after theoretically it had run out of fuel and disappeared. Just another little oddity that crept in. Those weren't the last planes to disappear. There have been many since. They've been certainly the more dramatic ones. Let's go from the top to the bottom. What about undersea craft, submarines? Very famous one in 1968. A nuclear submarine called the Scorpion was undergoing maneuvers with one of the US fleets in the Mediterranean, actually, and had travelled out all the way, as submarines usually do underwater, and was coming back to Norfolk, Virginia. Except that it never arrived. Radio communication stopped at a certain point, and it was never seen or found again. Correction. It was about 6 months later, about 3 miles down on the ocean bed, they did find a pulverized hull of a nuclear submarine that they did identify as that. No reason given, a lot of speculation, just happened. But again, while they were looking for this submarine, that same day, when it was 12 hours overdue, again, a very strange message came through on an unauthorized radio channel saying, Brandywine, this is Brandywine. That was the code name for the Scorpion. But that was all. Again, an interesting possibility parallel with the aircraft. As if there was a little bit of a time warp. As if something somehow was getting trapped and then being released. I don't know. Of course, the area itself, there have been all sorts of weird effects. Not just the sort of things we've been talking about, but travellers seeing, looking out there one day and seeing, I don't know, just like an enormous cauliflower, probably about the size of Cardiff. You just like a great big polystyrene bubble there, and in the distance, just sort of winking and looking at them. And as they went near, it just sort of floated away, never to be seen again. There have been very strange effects. I remember one nearer the shore, one man, or 2 men actually, in a fishing vessel, ocean-going fishing vessel, smallish one I suppose, saw a flame or a light. And when they approached it, in a still fairly deep ocean, they were amazed to see what seemed to be a pipe sticking up from the seabed with a flame coming from it. That really worried them. Never been able to explain that either. Certainly, there have been very strange effects. Vessels disappearing off radar screens. In fact, the Queen Elizabeth II was a victim of this back in the 70s, going out on a special voyage. The Coast Guard radar was watching its progress, and all of a sudden suddenly disappeared. It disappeared from all the radar screens on all the ships in the area, yet quite clearly it was there. They could see it visually, but from all the communication systems it had disappeared. Maybe there's a clue there. Maybe, well, in fact, we will be coming to talk about this a little bit later. Well, all right, there's a little summary of some of the weird things that have been happening in that area. What are the main characteristics? What makes them so mysterious, so fearsome, so feared of by mariners, by travellers? I think there are three. First of all, the suddenness with which it happens. One moment they're there, the second they're not, sort of thing. There was another very interesting airplane incident, while I remember it. This was in the 60s. Five fighter planes went into a cloud over Bermuda. 4 emerged. No trace of the remaining one. Nothing fell to the land. There was no radar detection, no wreckage, no nothing. Make of that what you will. The suddenness of it. Good example. Second, how it always seems to happen in the best of weather conditions. Fantastic. Everything is fine, marvellous, tropically idyllic. Gone. And the third characteristic, the futility of looking for any traces. Because with a few examples that I've talked about, I suppose when you get the remains of a nuclear submarine 3 miles down, well, yes, they tend to stay there with that enormous pressure of water, but all the rest, nope, no trace. So the suddenness, the apparent good weather and general conditions, and the lack of, or the quick dispersal of any evidence and the lack of any subsequent findings. All right then, you will be saying, surely researchers have been looking into this now for, how many 100 years? Have they come up with any thoughts, any ideas, any well-attested explanations? I don't know. What I shall do in the next few minutes is perhaps to run through a few of the ideas that have been put forward and see if they make... Oh, I'll throw them out. I won't come down on any one or any other. See what you make of them. Of course, because they happen in such a strange fashion, I suppose it's only human nature for us to want to opt very, very quickly for the bizarre, the dramatic, the unusual. And believe you me, quite a few very unusual theories have been put forward, and let me start with a few of them. Of course, you appreciate that area is was one of the favoured sites of ancient Atlantis. And as you also know, some authorities suggest that this was a very advanced civilization, perhaps more civilized than we were. Certainly they would have had, it is said, nuclear technology. Certainly they would have had all sorts of things before the Holocaust came and engulfed them. Could they have had a death ray? Is there to this day something trapped down at the bottom of that sea, an Atlantean death ray? Something that's put forward. Could somehow people be going into a parallel universe? You know, first you see them, then you don't. A time warp. Incidentally, there have been a number of instances, quite well attested ones, where planes have disappeared for a period of time and arrived sort of 10 minutes early before they should have done. But I'm not personally inclined to put a lot of credence on that, because I think planes missing for 12 minutes in a congested airspace, I think would be of great consternation to air traffic controllers, and I wonder whether this is part of a modern mythology, where although they're apparently very credible witnesses, I don't know. What about UFOs, UFO abductions? Now here we are. Quite a lot of instances, as you know, elsewhere, where people have apparently been intercepted, shall I say, by alien entities, otherworldly entities, little green men from outer space or whatever, where they've been taken aboard craft, medically examined apparently, and so on. Could it be that we have a whole fleet of human-snatching aliens coming down, zapping in there, picking these people off and taking them away? Don't know. Now, let me say, although I seem a bit cynical about all of these various ideas that have been put forward, I don't suppose I should be really. It'd be very unscientific for me to be cynical without any evidence. All of these things are possible because we have no evidence that they're not. And to be scientific, you always have to keep an open mind. However, there is also in research over the years some well-developed ways of treating anomalies, one of which is called, you'll know, Occam's razor. Old Bill Occam, he had this great idea, and he said, well, look, when you're faced with all sorts of odd, bizarre events like this, surely the simplest thing to do is to exhaust to completion the more ordinary possible explanations before you go in inventing parallel universes and so on. And I think possibly this ought to guide us, because certainly to my way of thinking, there are many equally bizarre possible explanations that I think might well find more favour with more people. And what I'll try to do is to go through a few of them. And as I say, they're still pretty bizarre, but I think they're more within the possible bounds of explanation for intelligent people like ourselves here today. All right then, let's take a very obvious one. And that is that a lot of these vessels, certainly in the last 100 years or so, the ocean-going ones anyway, the ships, could they have collided with other obstacles? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that is very possible, because from the 1700s onwards, wooden ships, and then of course the metal ones came along, for various reasons they were being sunk, capsized, turned over, made derelict. And certainly from 1890 onwards, the US Coast Guard Commission started going around counting these. And it turned out that at the end of the last century, there were 2,500 floating wrecks around this area we're talking about. 2,500. That's an awful lot. And about a third of them could be identified by name. So, I mean, there's nothing bizarre about it. They were floating wrecks. And I think we have to give some credence to the possibility that a vessel may have just hit into one of these. And literally, it was only by about 1930 that they'd succeeded in clearing that area of these dangerous obstacles. So that ought to weigh a little bit positively with us, to some extent anyway. Oh, a lovely one that I like is, of course, that the crews might have been abducted not by aliens, little green men, but rather bigger green octopuses. We see these lovely pictures, these old etchings of this huge thing of the size of Cardiff docks, these huge multi-tentacled squids. Again, more of the folklore of the sailors, I think, because in actual fact, these giant squids do exist, and they grow to enormous sizes, but they're very, very shy and tend to keep well away from crafts, and they certainly wouldn't want to go fighting any humans. Right now then, what about weather conditions? Because this seems to be almost at the centre of it. I said earlier that everything seems to be fine and dandy, literally, when these rather strange incidents take place. But is it? When you think of an area like that, Bermuda, Jamaica, tropical, very tropical, nice, warm, just the sort of place to spend a whole day if you're after sunshine. And yet you see, the facts when you look into them rather deny this. It's actually one of the stormiest areas in the world. The storms are very ferocious and rather short-lived, so while you may have sort of weeks on end with a lovely fine sunshine, not a wisp of wind, all of a sudden something will happen and it's over perhaps in an hour, and it's wrecked half of the few islands with it. Sort of tornadoes, sort of waterspouts. On land they'd be called tornadoes, on ocean they'd be called waterspouts, whereby a rather unusual combination of wind and currents can produce these very strange effects, possibly the sort of hole that pulled down that wild goose one that I was talking about earlier. You see, there we have the Gulf Stream, which is relatively warm water rising to the surface, and deeper currents coming in from out of the deep Atlantic Ocean, swirling, and you can get some eddies, you can get some currents of quite enormous strength. Anything that gets caught in one of those when it's in a bad mood is really to be pitied. As far as aircraft are concerned, very interesting, because again, On a normal day, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But it does suffer, that area does suffer from what is called clear air turbulence, and suffers rather badly. What this means is, well, I'll give you a little incident, tell you about it. One particular pilot was driving, flying, piloting over that area, and all of a sudden found that within a matter of seconds he'd shot up about a mile into the air. So, quick as a flash, he shut off his engine and started diving at 100 miles an hour down, nose diving, and was still going up. So it gives you an idea of if one of those takes you by surprise, clear air turbulence, it's a bit nasty, and it can happen the other way as well. Suddenly the bottom drops out of the air and down you go, very quickly. Yes, I think my young lady friend was lucky not to meet one of those when it's on duty. Now then, over the number of years, of course, because you get strange weather effects like that, you get lightning, and possibly ball lightning, and they can make rather a mess of a ship, whether it's metal hulled or timber framed, whatever. And we know of many instances where lightning has done a great deal of damage in these freak storms. But what I'm going to tell you now probably gives a lot more food for thought, especially as it'll lead nicely on to some of the other mysteries that we're going to talk about. So while I'm not guiding you in any particular direction, it does seem from all the evidence that a number of things that have been put forward over recent years, a number of ideas, do have a lot to commend them. Our friend down here was talking earlier, before we started the lecture, about electromagnetic radiation, and how he was mentioning to me how we know so very little about the entire spectrum that is available to us, and I would say indeed, absolutely. Look at this. This area is noted for hot, dry winds, so-called doldrums. You know what in the doldrums means? And the doldrums certainly affected very badly all the ancient mariners of old, where they were becalmed for weeks, months on end. But the doldrums also refers to a wind of a different sort, the hot, dry winds, which are very nasty, and I'll tell you why they're nasty. I think most of us here will have heard of ions, positive ions, negative ions, and how positive ions are supposed to be bad for you, negative ions are good for you. Normally in a normal atmosphere, the ratio of negative ions to positive ions is about 12 to 10. You get more negative ions than positive ones, and that's good. That's how you want it, because that's how our bodies like it in their environment. But what happens when you get these nasty, dry winds? And they're known all over the world. The Mistral in France. Anyway, they've all got their little local names. What happens is that all of a sudden, the electrical environment changes, and changes very rapidly and for the worse. You get a lot of positive ions all of a sudden, and the effect upon the human body and the human mind is devastating. All of a sudden, the people get disorientated, they get sick, they get tense, they get aggressive, annoyed, they get fed up, things go wrong, they can't see, they get hallucinations, and a lot more. Interesting how these sort of things fit in with some of the reports of people when their vessels are about to disappear. Interesting also how, particularly in later years, when we have metal-framed, metal-constructed ships, aircraft, and even cars, of course. Interesting side point here. Because these ships, these aircraft, are almost Faraday cages. They are insulated electrically from the environment. And in these conditions, you get a build-up inside of enormous positive charges, and it cannot be counteracted by the Earth's normal, slightly negative charge because of the metal. And that just builds up and builds up. And I'll tell you something else too. We're not sitting on plastic seats. Yes, you are. Now watch it. We'll have a riot in a minute. Because recent research has indicated that the negative electric fields, which attract positive ions, remember, which is the baddies, negative electric fields that can be generated by polyethylene in particular, the technical figures, something like 1,000 volts per meter, which is pretty large, And certainly courts of inquiry have looked at technical evidence for ordinary plane crashes, but certainly in the last 20 years, 4 or 5 quite nasty ones on land crashes have been attributed to literally the plastic on the seating in the aircraft, and the effect it has on the pilots that I mentioned, attracting in all the positive ions and having all these nasty effects. So, perhaps beginning to fit together a little bit. I don't know. Of course, there's one final, absolutely final thing we can add on this one, and of course that over in the Bermuda Triangle, you've just come in, don't forget, from the deep ocean, where, as I say, 5,000 kilometers, 3 miles depth of water is pretty standard. So you're coming down now to almost a continental shelf, and you're now beginning to be able to detect geomagnetic anomalies, buried minerals, and of course these are going to have quite a significant effect upon navigational instruments, but certainly, and by no means least, the electromagnetic environment that I've been talking about. Again, that with a hot, dry wind, you get those two acting together, and boy, you've got a recipe for ready-made disaster on your hands just waiting to happen. So, it would appear that if we put a low credibility value on little green men from outer space and time warps and Atlantean death rays, if we then look at and say, well, yes, it's possible that a lot of them could have happened because of natural obstacles, we're then coming to seeing how freak but usual weather conditions can pile up, and by no means least, a lot of very, very strange electromagnetic aberrations causing untold variations in human personality. For example, coming back to the Mary Celeste, what probably happened there by agreement with most authorities, but not all, most people will say it probably happened at something like this. There they were in the middle of one of these hot, dry winds, a freak storm, water spout, little whirlwind, of itself did no damage at all, just sort of lifted the hatch off the cargo. But the captain then, going to have a look in there, uses his depth gauge and finds that that's flooded, and because the positive ion effect I'm talking about, he and the crew are a little bit dazed, especially after this wind has come, and they take the reading and they find, Christ, it's much bigger than they thought it was, because the gauge was malfunctioning. Didn't think to check it another way, just abandoned ship to get away from it because of the flammability of that cargo. A couple of barrels had burst anyway, and there's lethal, toxic and flammable vapors floating around there. So off onto the boat. And then, of course, after a while, realizing the ship isn't sinking at all, but by then, far too late. They wouldn't have lasted hours if being caught up with one of those little eddies. I don't know. Right then, so much or so little for the Bermuda Triangle and its anomalies. Let's move literally a lot nearer home. This might seem a bit disjointed, but I think you'll see in a moment what I'm getting at, because I'll ask you whether you see any similarities between all these various types of anomalies that we're going to talk about and have talked about. 1977, as many of you will recall, was a bumper year for UFO sightings in West Wales. Basically a triangle from St David's, Haverfordwest and Stack Rocks. Again, a media invention. But that wasn't the only media invention associated with this particular case. It happened, as it always does, at certain times of the year. I don't know whether you've looked at UFO reporting statistics, but they seem to happen, they come in two peaks. February and September. So you say, right, you're a good researcher, and you work out now then what variations in the Earth's magnetic field are there about those times of year, what weather conditions are there. But of course, if you're a physical scientist, that's the way you will think. If you're a sociologist or a rather hard-bitten researcher, anomaly researcher like myself, you'll know there's another explanation, a rather more mundane, prosaic one. February, September are what they call in Fleet Street, what's left of it, the silly season. There's no news, there's no real news, so they either invent it or blow up anything that's psychic or UFO or little green men to fill the space that they need to fill. And of course, that's exactly what happened in 1977 there. A colleague of mine, Hilary Evans, one of the foremost UFO researchers in the world, went down there and spent a couple of weeks there personally interviewing all the people. This was after 3 flamboyant gee whiz bang books had been published about it, and they had the world's press camping there for months, interviewing children who'd seen little silver men in spacesuits, lots of sightings. And the great one was this, you see. So many people had said, well, Stack Rocks is a UFO base because we've actually seen them. We've seen them, actually, the craft lit up and across the sky, and then going back right into Stack Rocks. As you might imagine, a physical examination of Stack Rocks in great detail revealed no secret trapdoors and no nothing at all. And it turns out that, yes, a lot of it was made up. A lot of it was hyped onto ordinary sightings of strange lights. Undeniably, there were sightings of strange lights. And I'm sure you'll appreciate that the mind, under certain conditions, has a habit of interpreting things the way it wants to interpret them. A light over there can be interpreted by different people in different times according to the mythology they were brought up in, their religious persuasions, the culture. For example, an amorphous shape of light to people in Portugal could be the Virgin Mary. To somebody in West Wales, it could be the coming of the Space Brothers. To somebody in India, it could be a holy figure of a different persuasion. See what I'm getting at? Well, I'll come back to that if you don't. I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's very telling. Anyway, we're still down in Dyfed, and there was no doubt about it that there were lights, and they could not be satisfactorily explained. Until about 10 years ago, when researchers, in fact, within our association, indeed, in fact, many of the founders were doing a lot of research in this area, and it's highly intriguing research. Coming back to UFO sighting statistics, it'll come as no surprise that most sightings are seen where there are most people. So if you take all the UFO sightings for the past 20 years and put them on a map of the country, it comes as no surprise at all that they're all grouped in centres of population. But if you do a very clever trick, and if you say, well, all right, we'll divide this map down into fairly small areas, little tiny squares, and we'll take the, say there's an area where there are 20 UFO sightings in that area, divide it by the population in that area and redraw the map. In other words, what you are plotting is not sightings, but sightings per head of population, if you follow me. And now see what it looks like. Heavens above, what a shock. What you find all of a sudden is that the sightings per head of population have shifted to the west of the country largely, all up and down the Welsh coast, the Scottish coast, the Cornish coast. Very little on the east coast and very little over London compared with the population. And this is even more incredible if you take another map, which are readily available in other books, maps plotting the preponderance of ancient sites, old stone circles, megalithic barrows, sacred sites. You will find almost exactly the same shape, the same distribution. All over to the west, from Westminster onwards, from all stations west. You think, what the hell is going on here? If you then take a third map, of course I'm jumping all the intuitive research that led to this, naturally I'm just giving you the results. If you then take a third map, which is a geological map of Britain, and you look to see where all the most igneous rocks are, the ancient rocks, the old rocks, those heavily quartz containing, those which have fault lines in them, you will find that there's very little indeed over the west of England, one or two here and there in the Midlands, okay, but again, right over to the west. Granite, yeah, a few up in Scotland, of course, naturally, Grampians, but mainly up and down the west coast. So what have you got there? You've got a preponderance of UFO sightings, you have a preponderance of stone circles, you have a preponderance of geological fault lines and quartz-containing rocks. So what, you say? So what? Okay, so this perhaps. Anybody here smoke? Got a lighter? You got a lighter? Cigarette lighter, please? I wonder if this will work. This is probably, is this a crystal? Is this a crystal one?
No.
Sorry. Anyway, never mind. We'll pretend. There's a quartz crystal in there, right? Most modern lighters have quartz crystal there. And what you do to ignite the lighter, you just squeeze the crystal, and you get a spark. Bingo, you saw it, didn't you? From that imaginary quartz crystal we had there. But that's how it should work, right? Thank you very much. So it is known as the piezoelectric effect. You squeeze a quartz crystal, you get a spark. Just imagine that process being repeated on a 10 million times greater scale, where you get the pressures, the enormous pressures generated within the Earth's crust and coming really up against each other in fault lines. You get all that tremendous pressure, as I say, astronomically high figures, pressing upon quartz. What do you get? In effect, a jumbo spark. A spark that normally sparks short-lived, as we saw there, right? Squeeze, bingo, gone. But when you get such enormous energy there, what happens is that you ionize the gas. You strip the electrons off the molecules in this atmosphere, this ball of gas. And it has a considerably longer life then. And it's living energy almost. All that has been taken into this ball, a bit like ball lightning, and possibly that might even account for some ball lightning. We don't even know what ball lightning is. So you get all these things floating around, and there they go floating up into the air. You see, it's a natural tendency, isn't it, for us to see a light there or in the sky. It's a natural tendency for us to assume it's come down. Could come up equally well. And this is why they've the term they use these days is called earth lights, because they're generated from the earth. Right, okay then. So, here we are. A possible explanation for many, but I stress many, certainly not all UFO sightings, but a large number of UFO sightings, strange lights in the sky, possibly explained this way. Now, it doesn't take a great leap of the imagination, does it, to think back over the millennia when our ancient forebears would have seen these strange lights at certain places, over and over again. And of course, these places would get a reputation for being different, special, sacred even. So then again it comes now as very little surprise as to these were possibly the reasons for citing the sacred sites where they were. Because that's where phenomena were observed, that's where events happened of an unusual, otherworldly, extraterrestrial, in the spiritual sense, nature. So I do stress that while we've tied up, or we have a strong link, a firm link between UFOs, sacred sites, and geological anomalies, this doesn't explain all UFO sightings. It's far, far more complex than that, but nevertheless, a nice tie-up for a great proportion of them. Of course, if you're a UFO buff, that's great, that's fine, but it can be a bit boring looking at the same lights in the sky all the time, and in recent years, a new phenomenon has come along to perplex us, and I'm referring, of course, to the crop circle enigma. What a lovely phrase. The third triangle that I'm going to mention, the Wessex Triangle. From Wantage to Winchester to Westbury. 3 W's. Wessex. Wantage, Winchester, Westbury. Of course, another media invention, because as we all know, these phenomena have been happening not just within that rather sketchily defined triangle, but over, dare I suggest, farther afield, in many other fields, in many other counties, all over the country, largely in the south and west of England for some unaccountable reason, but of course also in other countries. Prior to 1981, there weren't an awful lot around. Researchers have wondered as to why this might be. Was it perhaps because people didn't know what they were looking for, that they were there all the time? Certainly some old farmers said, oh, we've been seeing these for years, you know. But I don't think that's a generally credible explanation. If there had been a great deal of them, rather widespread, I think a lot of people earlier on would have been taking a lot more interest, and they hadn't. Anyway, let's look at a few statistics. 1985. Again, you've got to be a bit careful about this because they're reporting statistics. There might have been a lot earlier on that have gone unreported. So, again, take this with a shovelful of salt, but it'll nevertheless give you an idea of how the phenomenon is progressing. So to give you an idea of how the phenomenon has progressed, 1985, 1986, about 36 sightings. 1987, 300. 1988, 700. 1989, 1,000, and possibly over 2,000 last year. An almost exponential rise. All right. What on earth is happening here? Are they being hoaxed? Undeniably, a proportion are, a small proportion. Even the experts have to admit that. But even so, the ones that are being hoaxed seem to be different in their anatomy, in their structure, in their shape, design from the others. There are ways of doing this, but whichever way it's done, it seems to show up as a hoax. The grain, the crop, seems to be trampled in a rather indiscriminate fashion. In so-called, in quotes, genuine ones, you get very complex interleaving, and often in different directions. And of course, one of the very bizarre things is how they happen so quickly, all at once in a number of different places, and very often under the eyes of observing researchers, without anyone seeing anything of any significance. I mean, if there were a gang of hoaxers, the conspiracy would have to be so enormous. You'd have to have literally thousands of people, I would have thought, the length and breadth of the country, all sort of working in unison, in concert, without anybody having the slightest idea that they were doing it. Now, human nature suggests to me that that's not terribly feasible, because half of them would have written books by now saying, I did it, I did it, I'll take the blame. But they haven't. Nobody has been told. In any quantity, yes, you get the odd one, certainly. All right, then. What are the other possibilities? Now then, let's come to our old electromagnetic friend again. Certainly, many reputable scientists have been taking this very seriously indeed. And Dr. Terence Meaden, a close neighbour of mine, he's written a number of books on this, and he has put forward what, not surprisingly, is known as the moving vortex theory. Vortex. What's a vortex? Swirling spiral, I suppose, really. Doesn't matter what of, it can be anything. In the Bermuda Triangle, it was water or air, water spouts, tornadoes. Indeed, in some of the UFO-like sightings, they appear to have a funny motion, a vertical motion sometimes. But certainly, Meaden suggests that there are well-known weather conditions that can happen over the Wessex crop fields, not dissimilar to the sort of things we've been talking about the Caribbean, whereby you can get ionized gases, a la UFO that we've been talking about, that can be created by these funny dry winds or something like that we've been talking about, and indeed containing great slugs of swirling energy and a splat. Now then, that was all right when you had just one circle. That is probably all right if you had two or three. But when they started coming 4 or 5 in all different places in exactly the same formation, the same distances apart, with rings swirling in anti-clockwise and clockwise directions, and last season when they came in these most bizarre patterns imaginable, where you had those squares coming in. All right, fair enough, a vortex, yes. Doesn't require much of a stretch of imagination to say a vortex can go splat onto a circle. But how do you make boxes? Anyway, they're not being outdone on this one. They're refining the general theory into a special theory of vortex creation, whereby, you put another threepence in and turn the handle, and you get another theory out to explain why it makes squares. How feasible you'd think this is, how credible, I don't know. So let's move on to the third one that's been put about a lot recently, and I don't know honestly what you'd make of this, because a lot of researchers, a small handful of researchers, have been looking at some of these ancient, some of these shapes, these funny shapes, these pictograms, and saying, where have we seen these before? Certainly, Mr. Michael Green, who is a historical researcher and archaeologist, and he's actually a chairman of the Centre for Crop Circle Studies, he's done a lot of work on this. He said, yeah, I know where I've seen these before. And he goes through all the ancient history books and finds that the one down at Alton Barnes near Salisbury bears a striking resemblance to a drawing found on some of the old cave walls. Another one is almost identical to some of the ancient forms of writing, certainly among Nordic tribes, going back thousands of years. Certainly they're suggesting that these are symbols, ancient symbols, that bear special reference to the planet, Earth, crops, growth. And the idea is that, in fact, one of them is even supposed to be the sacred symbol of Ceres, the goddess of corn herself, of course. You'd expect that, wouldn't you? And what they're saying is this: is it just possible that there are, shall I say, extraterrestrial forces, not necessarily little green men, but spiritual forces, if you like, ancient forces, forces is the wrong word, influences, that have been around an awful long time, very ancient influences. That's what you call them, nature spirits, using just a label, that's all. But influences that are rather concerned about what we're doing to the planet, and want to give us a nice little subtle message. They're saying, they're watching us, and if we don't mend our ways, then it's going to be a bit of a disaster all round. So there's your third theory. Hoax, electromagnetic radiation, a la UFOs, a la Bermuda Triangle, and the sources of the ancient wisdom. The cynic would say on the third point, well, you know, if somebody wanted to send us a message, why can't they spell it out in clear, plain English? And we get through to a lot more people. Well, you see, that is what's beginning to happen in certain places. But you can imagine now, well, what's happening. People say, but no, that's a hoax, isn't it? I mean, it's starting spelling out letters. But you can't have it always, can you? Is the message supposed to be symbolic and subtle? Will you accept it then? Or if you start spelling out actual words, will you accept it then? Or have we gone beyond what many people call the boggle threshold, which we all have, to different degrees, one on another? So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Probably a lot more questions than answers, but at least I hope what I've been able to do is to guide you through the turbulent areas of the various triangles, through meteorology, through electromagnetism, through ancient symbolism. Somehow, at least to get us thinking, I think, on the more productive courses, because I believe that it's by doing a lot of thoughtful research, without making up our minds too early, that we will be able to take these first few halting footsteps to finding out and answering, we hope, these fascinating, ancient and eternal of all questions. Who is man? What is his environment, his universe, his nature, and possibly, friends, his destiny?